So you may have heard the term DevOps, but you don't really know what it is. So what is it? So in software development, we obviously develop software. And that's something that a lot of us, even people who have never coded a day in their life, can sort of picture. That we sit there and we write a bunch of different types of code, and eventually we have a product that we give to everyone else to use. So it's not obviously that simple, but DevOps is one thing that can actually maybe help understand it better to those that don't really understand it. And for those that do understand it, I'm going to try to explain it in such a way that you can understand too. So when we are developing software, there are a lot of things that go into that. And some of that is reviewing code, like checking it over to make sure that there are no mistakes. And looking at dependencies is one thing that we have to do a lot, because dependencies may be something that we are using that somebody else created. So we kind of have to make sure that that is all in good order before we go live with it, especially if this is something like a web app that can be hacked. So other things are just testing, so that like we push our code through different environments and we test it. And a lot of times when we do that, we have to kind of build it from the ground up in this new environment. And so what DevOps really is it's development that helps the process of the software development, not so much the product that comes out of it. Now, I would argue, of course, that the product you end up with is going to be better because you use DevOps practices, but you're not actually writing code that directly affects the product. Now, what you are doing is you're instantiating a lot of these different types of tools. Now, a very simple one that a lot of people are familiar with is one called Git or GitHub or GitLab. Those are just tools that use the standard of Git. But basically, this is a tool where you can kind of store your code. You can have it remember different things you've saved, different iterations you've gone through of the code. You can have several people check out the code, make changes, and then put it all back into one thing. So that is something that is, what we would consider to be DevOps, because instead of passing files around and just trying to make sure we don't work out of the same file, we now have a more automated process to allow us to work on code together. Now, the thing is that DevOps covers almost everything in this area. This could even go as far out as to say a process that sends emails when a push request has been approved, something like that. Something more communications-based that help developers communicate better, something like Slack. You can really consider all of that DevOps, because what DevOps is really doing is it's combining development and operations. So to explain that, pretty simply, operations and development used to function quite, on their own rails. DevOps is an attempt to kind of get them in one place, because it would be the operations that would have used to have been more concerned about processes and rolling things out and all of that. And then developers are mostly concerned about, getting their new features done on time. So there's a little bit of a conflict between those two groups. One is a little bit more concerned about process, and the other is more concerned about new features and the product itself. So DevOps attempts to combine this to where we can now, in our development process, enact procedures that allow us to do things better in the long run, versus just trying to make the product better out of brute force. Not to say you don't still have to do that. You still have to think of good features. You still have to implement those features. But what DevOps does is it allows that entire process to go more smoothly every time, or at least that's the purpose of DevOps. And there's a lot of things that can be done with DevOps that, let's say you are running some type of web app and you do need to keep servers patched. Well, you can write programs that run in programs, kind of like ServiceNow, for instance. You can write a script that runs in something like Ansible, is an example, which is a program basically that will run periodically and patch your servers. or check for things that need to be, are these ports open? You can just run all sorts of checks and have it only bother you if it found something worth noting. So I hope this is putting it into perspective for you a little bit, that DevOps is basically automation. It really is anything when it comes to software development and even a lot of other things. DevOps is really about automation. And we automate these things because software is incredibly complex. And when we make mistakes in software, the complexity a lot of times shows. And then on the other hand, when it comes to the workload that comes with software, the complexity shows. Now, a lot of that complexity can be in a way reduced by automating the mundane tasks. Because each time we add something that complicates the software, that could potentially add a set of mundane tasks that must be done periodically. DevOps is really about automating that away and kind of gaining that complexity back, gaining that workforce back, that time that each person can spend working back. Because when we increase complexity, we increase mundane tasks. When we remove said mundane tasks, the consequences of complexity get a lot less severe. So there's a lot to DevOps, probably too much to talk about here. If you are into DevOps, the skills I should say that you should be looking at getting is one, Linux at this moment. A lot of these tools run better on Linux, and Linux command line experience is a big one that you should have if you want to go in this route and go towards, doing something in the DevOps space. Then also get to know these different tools. There's tons of these different tools. There's ones you may have heard of like GitHub or GitLab. Then there's ones that are a little bit less well known like Jenkins, Docker. And then there's ones that, I had not heard of in the least. For instance, Ansible was one I'd never heard of. Another one, I don't think I can even remember the name, but it's been more or less discontinued. But there's a lot of these different tools, way more than I just mentioned. And knowing what they are and what they can do is really good to, know if you're working in DevOps, because when you have a need, you'll at least have a good foot in your door entry point for, what you need to look at. Beyond that, just understanding software development itself is obviously necessary. Now, you don't have to be a brilliant coder to get into DevOps, but I think that your ability more to learn, that's the important part that comes from the developer mindset that you'll need, is that ability to learn, because these tools are all very different. A lot of them, you can build scripts within them, and they all use, different languages, and some of them are even proprietary languages. So it's a lot of work to kind of learn these new things, and it can be really intimidating. What we did in the class was really, we did just enough of each of them to get something done, but it was a lot of learning. So you have to have that mindset, I'd say, to be, decent in DevOps. But if you have that mindset and you're familiar with the software development process and, you are into automation, that is something that you respect it, you find it worthwhile, you find it rewarding, then I'd say, yeah, DevOps can be a good way for you to go. So anyway, hope you like this video. Have a good night.